Today I'd like to stay a little bit longer with on the subject of disidentification and how to be in mental pain without making that mental pain worse, which is obviously a pretty good thing to know about. If we're in mental pain, that's not good. We don't like that at all. And so if we react to make it worse, obviously that's the last thing we want to do. And yet it's what we will do, almost certainly. In the last episode I was talking about this idea that there's two very different ways for us to be in the very constrained and corpuscular modality where we're like a little blob, a painful little blob, a reactive little blob, which we all know. We've all had ample experience of that, and the other way of being in the world where we're a lot freer and not defined and more interactive with our environment. So instead of reacting to our environment like a super ball bouncing off surfaces, we interact with our environment, which is a more peaceful thing. So we could make the observation, which is borne out by experience, that when we're feeling bad in ourselves, our sense of self seems to constrict. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Robert Anton Wilson says in his writing somewhere that we're as big as the least thing that annoys us, which is a nice little point to make. So generally speaking, we can be annoyed by the most insignificantly little things. The tiniest thing could ignore us. Someone repetitively tapping their fingers on a tabletop, perhaps, or the colour of someone's shirt. And so at that point, going by what Robert Anton Wilson says, that's how big we are. We've shrunk, so that's the only important thing in our whole universe, so we care about, and that's a very trivial thing. There's more to us than that. There's more to the universe than that. But we've shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until all there is in our subjective universe is us being annoyed by some guy tapping his fingers repetitively on a tabletop. So that's fascinating. It's fascinating to think that that can happen. And when it does happen, what it means is that the thing that's annoying us annoys us more, because we're smaller, we're more petty. By definition, we're more easily irritated and annoyed by completely nonsensical, trivial things. So the smaller we get, the more we're in the market to be upset and aggravated and driven daft by the tiniest little things. So if our response to mental pain is to shrink or collapse or downsize ourselves, then we're doing the very thing that's going to make us suffer more, which isn't what we want, obviously. Who wants to suffer more when they're suffering? Most of us don't, anyway. So the question is, why are we shrinking? Why are we doing this thing that guarantees we're going to have a worse time when we're having a bad time? Why do we shrink? Why do we fixate? Why do we become so superficial and lose whatever broadness we had beforehand, whatever tolerance or resilience we had beforehand? And one way to look at this is to talk about being trapped in a polarity. that whenever we fixate on a polarity, and in this case the polarity is the thing that I'm being irritated by. So if someone's tapping their fingers on the table, that's the annoying or irritating thing, that's the really bad thing. And the really good thing would be if they just bloody stopped. So there's a polarity, good and bad. And I'm fixated on that. And when I get fixated on a polarity, then all that happens is that this polarity becomes the whole world for me. As I said earlier, there's nothing else in it. So when I'm in a polarity, anything I do within the framework of reference that is provided for me by the polarity makes that polarity stronger. I get stuck in it more. So the more I resent the fact that I'm being annoyed, or resent the guy that's annoying me, the more I reinforce the polarity. And also, if I try to struggle against the fact that I'm resenting or being annoyed by whatever it is, that also reinforces the polarity. So if I go with my emotion and be annoyed, that's making me shrink. And if I try and go the other way and resist and fight against what I'm actually feeling to rectify it, that also makes me smaller. Any sort of control at all is going to shrink me. And we can see this quite clearly in terms of issues. If an issue comes along, and we have to qualify that by saying it's an issue to me. It's not an issue in its own right. There's no such thing as an issue in its own right. But it could be an issue to me quite easily. I could have an issue with all sorts of things. If an issue comes along and I try to work with that issue so as to tell myself that it's not such a big deal, I shouldn't be getting so het up about it. In other words, if I try to psychologically reframe what's going on and work in some way with my thoughts so as to make the issue less of an issue, or making it more of an issue. Every single thing I do to try and fix that situation is making it more and more of an issue, because it's feeding into it. It's like a person who's trying to start a fight with you. You're kind of trapped because whatever you do is going to make that situation worse. If you tell them to get lost, it'll make it worse, and if you ignore them and don't talk to them, that'll make it worse as well. Somehow we're compelled to interact, either by ignoring them, which is an interaction, or rather it's a reaction, or fighting with them, which is also a reaction. And ignoring them and reacting to them are equal reactions. They're equally reactive. So it's a sticky situation. So when there's an issue there, the issue defines everything, and everything I do, whether I keep on saying this is awful, this is bad, this is completely unacceptable, that's going along with the issue. That's obviously, there's no difficulty in saying that that's going to make the issue a worse issue. But if I try and argue with myself that the issue isn't an issue and I'm okay with it, that approach also makes it a worse issue. And so that's what's happening when we're in psychological pain. We're using that frame of reference, that reactive frame of reference, and we have two possibilities. If I'm angry, I go along with the anger, and that feeds the anger. The more I get annoyed, the more I focus on stuff that's going to help me to get annoyed. And if I try and fight against that anger, that's also going to trap me in the anger. And all what are called negative emotions are like this. They're all traps in exactly this way, and all thoughts are traps in this way, because if I accept a thought and go along with it, that traps me, and if I try and reframe the thought, that traps me as well. And so this brings us to the point of talking about disidentification. And disidentification is where I don't fixate on the polarity. The polarity is trying to get me to do either the one thing or the other thing, go forward or go back, act out or repress. There's only two answers, only two responses in that situation. It's a very oversimplified situation. But disidentification would be where my attention isn't fixated on just this one thing, maybe the pain and how I would like to get away from the pain, or how bad it would be if I couldn't get away from the pain. So instead of fixating on that, I'm aware of everything that's going on, whether or not it has anything to do with the issue at hand. So I'm not drawn into particularities so much. My awareness is not narrowed down. I'm just aware of the whole of my situation. So I'm not fighting against the pain. The pain is there, and it's part of what I'm paying attention to. But there's also everything else. So what there is the whole of my subjective experience of what it feels like to be here, say sitting here, the whole of what that feels like. And the whole of what it feels like is not a polarity, because it's not defined in opposition to anything. It's neither good nor bad. Of course, that particular type of undivided attention is very rare. It would be great if we could rest in that whole or undivided attention. But the whole thing is, of course, that we can't. So then that brings us to the idea of not doing. We can't do undivided attention, because anything we do divides. Anything we deliberately do divides, because deliberation occurs towards a goal, or purposefully doing anything always has a goal in mind, and a goal is a divide. In its very essence, a goal is a divide or polarity. And a goal is a divide because the very nature or essence of a goal is it's different from what is not the goal. So when you talk about a goal, you're also talking about what is not the goal. Goal, not goal. Succeed, fail, hit, miss. So there you are. You've got a big juicy polarity right there, which happens every time we do anything deliberately or on purpose. So any talk of helpful things that you can do, or helpful ways that they are to think, once we understand this, we can also understand that any such talk as that is pure drivel. It's complete and utter drivel. There is no doing, because doing is what keeps us trapped in the trap. So it's like one of those things that traps us, like a thumb trap, that our thumb's caught, and whatever we try to do to pull it out just causes the trap to go tighter and tighter and tighter. So if there's one thing that we could learn, is to understand that all our doing, all our thinking tightens the trap, and it's painful anyway, otherwise we wouldn't be thinking of getting away from it, but it gets a lot more tighter then. So if there's just one thing we could learn, that would be it. And then, of course, there is always a question that we automatically do try to think of a way out, or we automatically do fight against the situation, and none of us have the power to stop what we're automatically doing. None of us have the power to stop reacting. If I try and stop reacting, I'm reacting against my reacting. I've got double reacting. It's not a great situation. It's in no way improved. But not reacting is not doing. Fighting against my reacting is not doing. It's just reacting. It's meta reacting. Thinking about my thinking is not thinking, it's meta thinking. So, because I can't fight against my reacting, what I can do is to be aware of my reacting and notice that I'm reacting. So that is the key thing. As Krishnamurti says, the seeing is the doing. It's not that we see something and then we do something based on what we see. We just see. And by seeing ourselves reacting, or by seeing ourselves narrowing ourselves down, we don't narrow down so much. And we don't react so much. The natural process is when we shrink ourselves down. We don't see ourselves shrinking down because we're so fixated. All our attention is on what it's on, and none of our attention is on us shrinking. Therefore, we shrink and shrink and shrink without knowing it, and we end up in this very painful situation of being a reified self or ego, which is pure pain. It's a hell state, basically. Hell is to be trapped in the concrete self. We don't normally think of being trapped in the concrete self as hell, because we think there's all sorts of possibilities for the concrete self to enjoy the world and life. And we're told it's the way to be, but actually it's hell. If we could see it, if we could really see it. And happiness isn't something that the concrete self can get. Happiness, as I said in the last episode, is when we become bigger than the concrete self. And that means we're not any type of self, we're just the space within which that concrete self exists. So with reacting, when we react, our attention is pinched and everything goes into the reacting and none of it goes into seeing that we are reacting. And where we think, if it's a thought that particularly grabs us, if it's an issue, if the thought is a big issue for us, then all of our attention goes into thinking, and absolutely none goes into seeing that we're thinking and noticing, there I go, look at, just noticing that that is happening. So when we're in this situation of being in mental pain, what helps us is to notice the way that we're responding to that situation by shrinking or fixating upon a polarity, or losing ourselves by concentrating on what the thought wants us to concentrate on. So by being aware of ourselves shrinking, we're not shrinking. And by being aware of ourselves reacting, we're not reacting. And by being aware of ourselves thinking, we're not thinking. We're thinking in a way, but We're not lost in the thought. So it's not the same thing. When we're lost in the thought, we have absolutely no sense at all that the thought is a thought. So we're completely absorbed in the mind-created virtual reality in that case. So the not doing in this case is to be aware of the totality of what's going on, in as much as we're able to, without getting sucked into what the trap is trying to suck us into. And if we have an awareness that there is a trap there, and that reacting or identifying gets us caught in this trap, then straight away we know what's going on. We're not so helpless. And even though a lot of the time we could fall for it, we won't fall for it so much, and as time goes on, we'll get better and better at not falling for it. Okay, thanks for watching.